I'll go ahead and get us started since we are at 9 o'clock. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Morgan Davis. I'm president here at the club. I think our guest needs no introduction. It seems like most of you know him, have read his work, and are familiar with what he has done as a prolific writer for the past few years. But we'll get a little bit more into what Pankaj has been doing and what he's been up to today. So, as we said, we'll keep this fairly casual since we're a nice tight group. So, we're using the mics to make sure that the sound can get picked up. But please, if you guys have any questions, feel free to jump in. We don't have to keep this as me just doing Q&A this whole time. So, if you want to jump in, please do. I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit, but I think again we're going to cover a little bit about Equator today, as you see in front of you, and then kind of talk about what it means, the work you've been doing, the book that you've had out earlier this year, and kind of the context for media today. And what we particularly as a foreign correspondence club here in Hong Kong need to be aware of. Do you want to start with just doing a quick introduction of yourself?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Um, I've actually been here a few times. I think the first time I came was in 2000 or maybe 2001, 24 years ago. Um, I think I was like 6 years into my career as a writer. The reason why I mention this is because, since you've invited me to present my, at least a abbreviated autobiography. I think I started, I published my first book in 95. Very soon started to write for many Western publications, um, and, continued to do more pieces, articles, books. 3 decades later, I find that, a lot of the work that I've done has been largely reactive in the sense that um, I've spent most of my time and energy fighting or battling some entrenched prejudices and biases within this sort of media that I became part of in the mid 90s. That makes for a very curiously unsatisfying experience or a career that is superficially at least you know semi-successful in the sense that the very fact that I can make a living off writing is a measure of success these days. And then there are other things, prizes, awards, but I think behind all that um, appearance of success is a certain anxiety that I've been part of a system that has been dysfunctional for some time, a way of thinking about the world, a way of reporting on the world that is shot through with internalized, unexamined ideas and assumptions, and that one needs to now escape from all that if one has the resources, if one has the kind of proper um, uh, support in terms of people willing to work or people willing to back a new project. It's time to create a new way of essentially not just doing journalism, but way of thinking about the world, and sort of making it clear that no nation, no part of the world at this point has a monopoly or should have a monopoly and how we interpret the world. What I mean by this is that I've spent my life, my writing life, in an environment where the United States and its European allies were the gold standard. They were the people, they were the countries, they were the societies everyone else was expected to imitate, to emulate their political institutions, their economic institutions. That was the whole assumption on which so much of Western journalism was based. And countries were judged, societies were judged on the basis of their success or failure in approximating that model of success held up by the United States and allies. So countries were given grades, India is a democracy, China is not, various other ways of assessing, which now seem extremely superficial. And I think, now that the democracy versus authoritarianism model doesn't hold, so what are we left with here? One by one, a lot of these analytical frameworks have collapsed around us. What replaces them is the question. I don't think Western journalism as it exists at this moment is even prepared, is even equipped intellectually to ask these harsh questions about itself. What it can do, really, and what it is doing right now, is simply to go along doing what it has been doing all this time, which is completely unhelpful. If you just look at the coverage of the New York Times the last few weeks, their editorials, they're all still in the same mold. You still have editorials saying, using phrases like the free world, how America should become a leader of the free world. You think, what is this fantasy that we're all inhabiting? Are you trying to persuade your millions of readers to enter this fantasy world of the free world? So I think we are looking at, to be honest, pathological levels of delusion and ideological self-deception. Let's try and look at the world as it is, without these preconceptions and assumptions. And really, I think this project is born out of that desire to break free of, the preconceptions, the assumptions that have underpinned journalism, intellectual journalism, political journalism, business journalism for far too long. Let's acknowledge the true diversity of human population, societies, political institutions, economic practices. Let's not try and fit them into some, model, abstract model that you think is hugely successful. And that should be, something that everyone else should imitate or emulate. I think it's very clear now, that we are well past that stage. You can keep pretending that we are still living in the free world, where America stands ready to assume the leadership of the free world. But I think the sensible people amongst us will know that this is a profound delusion, and would want to engage with the world in far more challenging and difficult ways. And I think, in a way, that's the challenge, this project, that some friends and I, like-minded people who've had similar trajectories, who've achieved, in some cases, much greater success than I have within the West, but are nevertheless convinced that we need to make a clean break with a lot of what passed for journalism, and that we need to do something different. So I can really only speak of my own career in the context of, all this that has happened, and that, so much of what I'm doing now really comes out of a profound sense of dissatisfaction with my own work, and as I said, the fact that so much of this work is simply reacting to very commonplace errors of thinking, historical ignorance, sometimes plain historical illiteracy. And that kind of work cannot really be satisfying beyond a point, because it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change, larger ecosystems. So the answer is to create your own ecosystem where the experiences of people like myself can find, a kind of proper setting.
So you've alluded to your project. We all see the Equator notes on the table. And I noticed on your Equator's website, it's described as a movement as much as a magazine. And I think you've alluded a little bit to what that means. But can you just explain a little bit more about what is Equator, and what you are hoping to get out of it with its structure?
But I think it's, I mean, I'm reluctant to call it a magazine or a periodical because I think our conception of it is much broader. Um, we think of this obviously as a multimedia platform. This is not just a text-driven publication. There will be videos, podcasts, public events, a lot of things that the so-called legacy periodicals are now doing, but they were not. They didn't start with that. Now they're all aware that they need to reach out to different audiences who may not want to read a 4,000 word piece. So, we need to have a video version of this, or we need to have a public event about this, or we need to have a podcast conversation about this. The advantage of starting now is that you can start with all that and not play catch up. So there is one side of that. But I think, movement is a somewhat fraught word. It reminds you of political movements or social movements. But I think there's something about an intellectual movement, which is to say that you're trying to make a break. You're trying to break very cleanly with previous practices. And the people making the break are people who have actually worked most of their lives within these institutions that we are trying to make a clean break from. People who work for The Guardian, people who work for The New Yorker, people who work for the New York Review of Books, the New York Times. So they have this sort of experience of working there and realize that journalism has become professionalized to a degree where it is now almost an adjunct to business and political elites. And by calling this a movement is like a movement away from all that, a movement into a realm where the ideas of the complexity of truth, the idea of human dignity, those should be our sort of guiding stars, not the national interest of the United States or the national interest of United Kingdom or the national interest of India. So we're trying to really, in bringing this kind of this level of experience and talent, so I say we are trying to redefine what it means to write about the world today, and not be beholden to certain very clearly identified interests. Not keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. I mean, again, I don't want to keep bringing up this paper again, but you look at what happened 20 years ago. The New York Times supported the war in Iraq. Today is running editorials about how China is a big threat. We need to have strong military. You have people running editorials saying there's a case for overthrowing the current leader of Venezuela, which is the war is about to erupt as I speak. So I think this kind of cheerleading for power that is increasingly reckless, I think we judge it to be politically reckless, intellectually reckless, spiritually harmful, and I think just overall a disastrous course for journalists to follow. So I think really in that sense, to answer your question, a movement away from catastrophically failed ideas where you become essentially a stenographer for the White House, become a stenographer for the Pentagon. We want to really get away from this kind of profound corruption of journalism, and very clear about that.
And how are you doing that as far as the contributors that you're looking to write, and how you are telling these stories? Are you looking for certain types of stories to include or certain types of contributors to be able to tell those stories?
Our sort of um, main motivation is to really look at the world, and I think something is implied in the title for this venture. Equator is, of course, a sort of imaginary line that supposedly divides the earth, but there's another connotation which is equating. Um, and so equating the experiences and perspectives of a vast majority of the human population with those of the people who've already had, in a way, a great say in great ability to amplify their experiences and perspectives. We've never had a major media platform in the world that says, look, the experiences, the perspective, the political traditions, or the philosophical traditions of Indonesia or China or India are perhaps as important as those of Europe and the United States. Um, why can't we simply accept that fact and make that part of our regular practice? Um, but we won't. We don't do that, and these institutions are not going to course correct that late stage in their lives. So the idea is to seek stories that actually open up, a new landscape altogether. So whether it's a story about football clubs in Argentina that are very opposed to the current leader of Argentina, whether it's a story about migrant workers in China. We just published a big piece on that, translated from Chinese into English. And you read these stories and you realize, this is an experience that, in a way, it resonates at so many different levels. And it gives those migrant workers a kind of dignity. You realize that these are we titled the piece the makers of modern China, but they're actually the makers of the modern world. These are the people who are creating the things, who are doing all these things that, in a way, have improved the living standards of countless people across the world. So highlighting those kinds of experiences, or whether it's a story about, a low caste writer in India, it's a story, again, on a different level altogether. The story about Ukrainians who don't want to fight, who are being forcibly conscripted. We had another piece about that. Um, in the piece itself said that the story is about Ukrainians resisting conscription, are being denied, being suppressed in the West because Western Europe, United States, until now at least, they wanted Ukraine to fight. And that's their kind of, in a way, main aim. And so people have suppressed or ignored stories that present a very complicated picture of what is going on within Ukraine. And now, of course, we know that, Zelensky is surrounded by incredibly corrupt people. There are lots of stories coming out. A lot of us have known this for some time. It's taken a while to become mainstream news. So again, bringing out stories that again have been ignored or marginalized because they don't fit in with these ideological prejudices or expectations uh, of much of the Western media. But actually, it's not even so much a question of, again, reacting to what the Western media is doing, but actually just going out into areas where normally these papers, these magazines would not go to, because they think this subject is not interesting enough for our readers. The story about Chinese migrant workers is not interesting to the New Yorker because the New Yorker reader is a middle class or upper middle class American with a certain cultural interest and taste. And the piece they want to read about China is about, what is China doing at this point, which is relevant to American interests. Those are the stories. So the human stories, the stories about aspiration, struggle, tragedy, those are not of great interest. So those stories get ignored. And we, I mean, we want to really, in a way, um, in a way, kind of embody a certain kind of humanism there, which is not tainted by any kind of political nationalist partisanship at this point.
Goodman. And so how do you have this balance of as you said, these publications that have target audiences, how do you look at, okay, we want people to read our stories, we want this message to get out, while also balancing that side of things? Is it a business decision? Is there an answer to how we look at the media as a business to be able to better tell these stories?
Well, I think, the certain things, like, how do we think of this as a business? It's very clear that a project like this is not going to be sustained, at least in its initial phases, by huge numbers of subscribers, that it'll take time for people to even understand what this is about and what this is doing differently. I mean, this, what we've done so far in a few weeks is only a very small part of what we actually intend to do. Hopefully, when there is more to see, there'll be more subscribers, and the numbers are growing all the time, but obviously not enough to sustain the whole project. And as I said, the project has attracted some of the best talents in the English-speaking world, editors, writers, whether it's Naomi Klein or Amitabh Ghosh. A lot of people want to publish with us, and a lot of people want to work with us, and we want to acknowledge what they're bringing to the table by also paying them well. All of that, as you know, costs money. We are starting out with very little, some good initial donations from people who want to see something like this out in the world. And I think we know that in the initial phases we'll have to depend on donors to get this project off the ground, and then assume all the many dimensions that we have imagined for it. And at the end of 2.5 to 3 years, according to our model, where we have enough subscribers to actually become self-sustaining, which is the ideal scenario, because we do not want to be donor dependent. There's just far too many, corpses of media organizations that were dependent on particular donors, especially individual donors, who then pulled the plug at some inconvenient time. And I think, our model is also, even though it draws upon, the experience and talent, of a very high quality, but keeping the numbers very low, keeping the staff, the people who are working for it, all of that really very much tightly under control, so that we don't spend a lot of money. And so our working costs, our operational costs remain low, and leave us with, bigger margins, as it were.
And is that structure important to you in the long run? I mean, I know we touched a bit on media trust when we look at things like the Washington Post and we're dealing with the Jeff Bezoses of the world. Owning these media companies, it has affected how a lot of people understand the news, and what is behind some of it. So is having this structure that you've set up here important for the long run for telling these stories too?
So sorry.
Sorry, so I guess the ownership model is essentially what I'm getting at. Is this something where you want to keep it small? You're not looking for a big owner in the long run.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, in a way, I felt freest, most liberated when I'm writing a book, because that book is not being underwritten by some media owner. This is a book, this is a project that is going to be first, finished at my desk, then it goes to an editor, then it goes to the publishing process. And there's no one saying, you can't write this, you can't do this. Um, Whereas my experience in writing articles has been quite the opposite in many cases. People always saying, we can't have this, we can't have that. That's the experience for a lot of people. So with something like this, it's very clear that the one way to maintain editorial autonomy is to remain close to your subscribers, to your readers, and not become too ambitious, not spend too much money, not start having grandiose plans about expansion, because once you start receiving that kind of money, then of course you become beholden to the people who are giving you money. So let's stay small, let's stay modest, but carry high impact things, whether it's pieces or interviews or conversations or public events, um, and avoid all these dangers that other people, other media organizations have been exposed to and have suffered as a result. So I think we are also in a good position to learn from the mistakes of many such startups in recent years, and to tell ourselves repeatedly that we must be very strict with what we do, how we expand, and just be very very aware that we cannot let ourselves become in a way enthralled to some big donor or even donors.
Does anyone want to jump in with a question? I can keep going. Yes, we'll start here. It's the mic. Yeah, thanks.
So you mentioned the New York Times a few times. I think most newspapers and media conglomerates, they say that they stand for something. There is something that explains why they write what they write and how they write about it. So like New York Times, I'm sure there was something about democracy, accountability. Wall Street Journal probably puts in more property rights or the capitalist system. I'm from Europe. Many left-wing European newspapers traditionally had something about the working, like upholding the working class. So, and you also mentioned that in reality, some of those publications seem to actually be beholden to elites, and that's where you lose your credibility. But so then you say we want to start something new. We do not want to do what we think the New York Times and others have done. If somebody asks you, what does Equator stand for in terms of, are there values that you uphold, or is it more anything goes? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, yeah. Sorry. Thank you. No, I think it's a fair question, and I would say very simply that we stand for the values of justice and compassion and dignity. These are not guaranteed by any political institution necessarily, any one political institution or any one economic institution. These are universal values, and I think it's time to uphold. It's time to talk about universal values that are really truly universal and not achieved, not maintained, not sustained by the power of some particular part of the world, of some particular nation or other. I'll give you another example. I mean, I mentioned the New York Times, Washington Post. Less said about it, the better. Wall Street Journal. I mean, I think there is a newspaper in Spain, I'm sure you know of it, called El País, which I think, and I read a lot of newspapers, many European ones as well, and I think it's the best newspaper in the world today. It's the best newspaper in the world today in the quality of its coverage. It's not particularly good on Asia and Africa. They have very few correspondents here. They are excellent at covering Europe and the Americas, both South and North. And their opinion section, highly sophisticated, their books coverage, their cultural coverage, it makes the Times or the Financial Times look like provincials, barbarians. Honestly, it's on another level altogether, intellectually. And I often wonder why that is so. It's celebrating its 50th anniversary. next year. It came into being in 1975, just when Spain was emerging from the dictatorship. And its project was very clear that we are here to help introduce Spain to a democratic process where individual rights, human dignity, these would be our main concerns. The great advantage for El País, and that answers my question, like why is it so good, is because El País doesn't have to carry the burden of, advancing Spanish national interests in some broad arena. It's not there to say, oh, Spain must have a really strong military or it must have a really strong NATO because China is emerging. It's free of all this bullshit. It's free of all this talk of the elites, talk of the powerful. It's saying, look, our commitment remains to certain democratic process, and we are going to be critical of the Spanish government if it violates those principles. So I think it's a different way of reporting on the world, and a different way of looking at the world, which is something that is not really compromised by any allegiance to a political elite or a business elite, but it's informed by certain very important values. And because it's such a young newspaper, it's staying close to those values. I think the problem with a lot of the big periodicals is that they've been around for a long time. They've somehow lost sight of what journalism is supposed to do. What journalism's traditional role has been as a fourth estate, as a pillar of democracy. And I think they've gotten too lost, and it's perhaps the advantage that a small newspaper in a small country has. It's not a small newspaper in the sense that actually this year it's probably the only newspaper in the world that posted a rise in print subscriptions or 23% over last year. So they're selling nearly 1 million copies in print. And they also have a big circulation in Latin America. So it's also in one sense it's a global newspaper. So
Only in Spanish.
only in Spanish. They have an English edition, but it's not particularly well developed. They haven't paid it much attention. So that suggests, and there are other examples I can think of, again, from small places, small countries, that it is possible, it's definitely possible, it has been possible to engage with the world differently. And I think, those are our examples. Those are the people we want to, we want to emulate in some ways, or we want to learn the secrets of their success.
It's a lot to do with editorial.
So
With editorial, I mean, if you're talking about, yes, there's a sort of, I sort of call that of thinking, and it's difficult for individual journalists to step out of it. But you think from an editorial point of view, they're leading the ideas that you think it's because they are owned by individuals. I mean, all those American publications you're talking about are all owned by individuals in one firm or another, no matter who's editing them, and we know that the editors are just like, you step out of line and you look,
yeah.
and you might have lost a job.
That's an important question, Michelle. I mean, I think, in my experience, the people I've worked with at these places at the Times or the New Yorker, individually, all people with a lot of ability and a lot of integrity.
Yeah.
So, when I am critical of these institutions, it's not because there are corrupt individuals at every level, but the people, there is, an implicit sort of discourse there. And even the best of editors, even the most sensitive of editors, have to make whatever they publish not stray too far from that discourse or contradict it too directly. So there have been many instances where, this has come to light. I will give you one. I remember going to Pakistan to write about Pakistani writers in English. And one of these writers, who now lives in England, said to me that, you know, my life story is very deeply connected to what the Americans did in this part of the world because they supported an Islamist dictator. Um, that Islamist dictator, with the help of the CIA, persecuted many people in Pakistan, especially trade unionists. His father and his uncle were trade unionists, these writers. And they were put in jail and they were tortured. And when they came out, they fled Pakistan and went to the UK. They were middle class people in Pakistan. In the UK, they were menial workers when they arrived. And then they, kind of worked their way up into the lower middle class. And this writer grew up in a very, small working class town in the north of England. So he's describing his life history and basically saying how it connects with this larger global history of the CIA's support for a Pakistani dictator's support for Islamic extremists in Afghanistan. So I put that in the narrative. I thought this is interesting, and the editor, was very nice, took that, and then the directive came to her from her boss, saying, "I need to push back against what this writer is saying because he's clearly anti-American." This might seem an extreme instance of sensitivity, but there are so many such experiences that people like myself have had. It becomes very clear that there is a certain discourse there, and it's a great shame because I think most readers of that article would not flinch at all in reading that. They would not see it as anti-American, but there are people who are in a way, keeping certain not very particularly harsh truths from their public. And I think that has been really one of the great tragedies.
That's gotten worse.
That's gotten worse. So the public has been infantilized, by people simply taking out things that they think are going to offend, are going to irritate their readers. When sort of something like that, anyone can read and understand what's going on here. Anyway, the to cut a long story short, I took that piece away from the magazine and gave it to someone else who published it without any problems. But I think what I'm trying to say is that there is always someone or other who will step in and enforce the party line. I use the party line thing quite deliberately because we tend to think that it's only in authoritarian societies the party is enforcing its writ, but it's also there in so-called democracies.
But Pankaj, you used a moment ago, you used the term corruption in journalism. Is that what you're talking about?
I think corruption in journalism refers to something more than this. It's certainly allegiance to the discourse that you think is acceptable to the political elites in the country and acceptable also to your readers. You don't want to be seen as too radical, to be too critical of the establishment or the government's decisions and so on. But also, I think the proximity to power, which is very distorting. To give you an example, we've stopped talking about this now. For years and years, it was clear that Joe Biden was not in a good place. It was clear right from the very first presidential campaign that this guy is out to lunch. He could barely put together a sentence. Now we know a lot of people knew about this in Washington, D.C. They knew about this in New York. You have a massive bureau in Washington, D.C. Why did you not report on the fact that the so-called leader of the world is barely coherent? He's sleeping most of the time. I mean, there's just so many stories that have come out. It's an enormous scandal. And the scandal reflects very poorly on this media of the free world. Like, what were you doing all this time? And it's because if you start digging into this, you will, or at least there's the fear that you might be shut out from access to power. So those are the kind of subtle forms of corruption. So you end up suppressing the fact. The fact is revealed at a very critical stage in the political process. Donald Trump comes in. I mean, think about the consequences of suppressing that. If we had found out, if everyone had known that this guy is just, someone should be retired very quickly, maybe he should resign from the presidency and someone else should take that place, have a proper primary in the democratic elections, get a proper candidate instead of one who was chosen by default because it was so late in the process. I think that's sort of one example of this kind of corruption, and also kind of automatic deference to power and authority, which you see over and over again. Which you see in the coverage of the Iraq War, you see in the coverage of these other wars. They're still pretending that the White House or the presidency is a dignified institution. When every day the president tramples it into the ground, you're still pretending that what he's saying should make sense or trying to make sense of it.
What's your philosophy around social media? I see you've got an Instagram site. So you're like everybody else. You've got a, I guess, sorry.
Yeah, towards social media. You're on your Instagram, so you're already, I guess, sort of relying on Mark Zuckerberg to an extent. What's your philosophy in terms of how you want to use it or not use it, how you want to engage or disengage through these channels? Thanks.
Yeah, I think there can't be any really philosophy as such. I think there can only be a series of expedient moves whereby you temporarily at least embrace existing media technologies in order to get the word out without reposing too much faith in the ability of these, digital technologies to do much. But as mediums, as, channels, through which your work moves and goes out to a wider public, at this point, they are indispensable. So one has to work with them at this point. It would be nice to reach a stage where, you can afford to turn your back on them. We aren't there yet, certainly not as a small sort of startup. But obviously, I think we are going to avoid explicitly evil social media platforms, which make, no bones about, just kind of promoting an extremist agenda. I mean, sorry?
Can you give it?
Well, there are all those, the new ones that are emerging across the United States, which, really are devoted to systematic disinformation. Instagram, I've never been a social media sort of person in any of those places, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. But Instagram strikes me as probably the least offensive of all the social media platforms that exist right now.
Pankaj, I have another question, and that's some of the topics I feel you may be writing about are actually covered in the academic world. And one of the things that gets me, I generally write about art and culture and heritage, and the academics don't cross over into the more populist press, and it really pisses me off because so much money, resources goes into academia. And I just would be interested in your comments.
Thank you, Joe. I mean, I think that's a really important question that allows me to actually elaborate why we think that the intellectual journalism we are doing is different. We are very extremely aware that scholarship over the last few decades has become more and more sophisticated. Academic scholarship is really quite extraordinary at this point in every realm. Journalism, in contrast, has become shallower and shallower. There was a very important link once between journalism and scholarship that was broken. It was there in the 40s and 50s when scholarship wasn't so developed, But nevertheless, a lot of people, you'll see people who are writing for the Post, for the Guardian, for the Times in London, for the Financial Times. These were people who were, if not themselves academics, people with a lot of experience of academic scholarship, with an interest in it. So they were drawing upon that scholarship in their thinking about the work. That is more or less stopped. So now you have columnists in the Times, in the FT, who, with some exceptions here and there, are completely ignorant of what is going on in academia, of what people are saying or thinking. So this is something we very explicitly set out with, is to repair that very essential bridge between academia and journalism and reportage, that whatever pieces we do, we need to make sure that whoever is doing them is fully aware of the scholarship done on that. That whole model of, popularized by George Orwell of V.S. Naipaul, guy just shows up in Iran and meets a few people and writes up a report. I'm sorry, that's defunct. You've got to do your reading. You've got to do your reading about Iran before you get there. And you've got to do a lot more reading after you come back. And just be on top of that stuff. So introduce a quality of rigor, into what we call journalism today. Otherwise, it's just like people are just phoning in their stuff. You look at most of the FT pieces, the New York Times pieces, there are just people literally saying whatever comes, them, unexamined, and just putting it out there.
It's also a lot of personal opinion.
A lot of personal opinion. A lot of personal opinion.
There's, of course, congregations out here, as you described, bigger. But in the USA, the nation that brings in another view, it's not mainstream. In France, Le Monde Diplomatique, I could name other ones. Of course, they are around a long time, but they never come out of the niche. They never go into mainstream, so they never have the audience. And some of them who start with a new view, then like Politico, then they got brought up, like Politico by Springer, right-wing, extremely pro-American German publication. So for you, how you can attempt to get out of the niche and become bigger, and once you become bigger and have some influence, of not being kind of bought up by, tempted by become a millionaire, that they can stop writing.
I think, one thing I can safely say that none of us are doing it for money. I'm not taking a penny from this. Still not taking a penny. Even this trip to Hong Kong, I'm paying it out of my own, resources. So we're not really going to be tempted by some big offer by someone. And, a lot of people I know have started media outfits so that they will attract the attention of some, billionaire and then sell it and then live the rest of their lives happily with the money they make. That's the farthest, very far from our intentions at this point. I think to the other question you raise about the niche thing, I think that's really important. I feel like the nation is very much confined by its location, first of all, in the United States, and it's kind of very explicit political allegiance to the American left. Once you start doing that, you're automatically self-provincializing. You're confining yourself to certain debates within the American left that are of zero interest to people outside of America. Or they even actually of zero interest to people outside of New York. Le Monde Diplomatique is a much more interesting because that's actually truly international magazine. And you're very right in that they actually do draw upon academics who can write well about a subject, who have a certain experience and, professional expertise in that area. It's a mystery to me why, that organization or why that magazine or why that periodical is not better known. or hasn't broken out of that, kind of French, European. I subscribe to it. Yeah, maybe, but it's not, it's not kind of made an impact outside a very small circle. But maybe it's not. I mean, I think they do ask people from, North Africa, for instance, to write, but they don't, I mean, I think what we are trying to do is like find writers in China who are living there. We want to find writers in India, in Sri Lanka. We we don't want to actually just have some person sitting in Europe and America write about them. And that's also where we are different, perhaps, from Le Monde Diplomatique, is actually seeking out people within what is now a very impressive non-Western intelligentsia, which wasn't really there 20, 25 years ago.
So one of my first thoughts on it, was actually, do you, this is a bit of a sort of rhetorical question, but do you sort of think that the all of the world's media is basically led by the English media because it just dominates so much, no matter what language you're writing in?
I think, I mean, certainly people in the Anglophone world, people who work or think or write in English, they are certainly definitely enthralled to the Anglo-American media. I wouldn't say this about, for instance, the Spanish-speaking world. For them, their references are different. I mean, they might refer occasionally to the New York Times.
But then getting information from them, do you think that El País is a by group?
It's a Prisa group. It's a Spanish group, business group. Yeah, yeah. They're business people, but they're not really. I mean, I don't see them taking the lead of any of the Anglo-American. They have a very independent position on many different things.
Without French.
So yeah, and they're very. I mean, I think one distinctive feature. This is not relevant to your question. I find about them is that when they report something that Trump has said, in the very first paragraph, they will make clear that it's a lie. Rather than taking it further and saying, like, there's a piece I was in the loo at the FCC here from yesterday's New York Times on the front page about Trump's justification for invading Venezuela. It uses up a lot of words to tell you that his reasons are bullshit. Well, you just say it in the first sentence.
I've had discussion with people from, and they're like, well, we have to report. And I say, yeah, but it's taking you 3 paragraphs to say it's crap. Like, why is it taking you 3 paragraphs? Why is it in the first line that this is actually totally unfounded claim?
Yeah. I mean, yesterday you said 2,000 years ago or something, we had this place, we had all this oil, and now it's, now, are you going to take that seriously and say, what experts say that 2,000 years ago, there was no America?
There is one other point.
There is one other point, and that is exactly that. This, it drives me crazy, especially on websites, the waffle to make fairly innocuous statements, just waffle. And it's by writers who either don't know their subject or it's a trendy topic, which they think they can just elongate so they can fit another advertisement in. But the waffle, a journalistic waffle it's just something, as a kid, reading newspapers, I don't remember. And your point about saying Trump is talking rubbish at the start, they actually wanted to have their waffle, then bring it in later. So, you've got the feed, you're looking online for an extra minute.
Yeah. Well, I think, in many ways, Trump has been a godsend for a certain kind of mediocre journalism because it has allowed the people practicing it to look superior. And there have been some commercial advantages to that, too. I mean, Trump has been a great boon for newspaper journalism in general. The subscriptions went up because people were trying to figure out, like, what is happening? Who is this guy? How did he come to power? And I think it was very easy to look down upon him, mock him in that, waffly way. So, yeah, I think a lot of careers have been forged in opposition to him, but, not at the service of good journalism.
How do we thread a needle between what you pointed out, the infantilization of our readers and the audiences, and not becoming the elite that they immediately turn away from because they say, oh, they don't understand us. This is they're trying to become intellectually superior.
I think, one way of doing that is to not imagine your reader to be this ignorant person, not sort of think that this is a person who needs to be spoon fed information and needs to be protected. I think we are living in a political culture where there is nothing hidden anymore. Power reveals its, kind of completely red, tooth and claw. Um, I think it's time now to be pretty upfront with the reader, and not trying to tretify what's going on here, and just be very clear whether it's saying in the very first paragraph that the president of the United States is a compulsive liar and a fantasist, or saying this is what people think, this is what people feel about this. Many people, and present it to the reader. I think a lot of the problems right now, that traditional journalism is suffering from actually do come from elites assuming that we need to protect the reader from certain forms of knowledge. That also might be, in a way, dangerous for our own position. And that's what I mean by this kind of complicity with business and power elites. The reason why they don't want to attack Trump in the way El País does directly is because there's a mistaken notion that your own dignity as a journalist is somehow related to the dignity of the presidency of the United States. And that's what I mean. There's a very serious distortions that creep into your thinking about the world when you connect your position in the world, your status in the world, with some larger national institution or with some larger national fortune or national interest. So criticizing or basically coming out and saying the president of the United States is now occupied by a lunatic is like giving the whole game away, in which your own position is endangered because you are part of that game. This is what I mean. This is the dangerous bit. The elite complicity across a very broad spectrum, and the reader, of course, finds out that this is the game that the elites are playing, and turn away from that kind of journalism, thinking this is just a stitch up. I'd rather go to some radio podcaster or some vodcaster, as they call them. Um,
We've just got 2 minutes left, so I want to make sure we fit in a couple questions. I know everyone is. I'm like checking my watch to make sure we get everyone in. So yes, we'll do a question here, and then I think you had one last question too.
Of course, there's the hegemon out there who wants to impose his view, and in the West, it's the hegemon is the power that you described. We have seen very much how powerful groups want to stay in power. When Trump came to power, how the big New York law firms, they completely caved in order to stay close to that power. That's how elites work. That's just opportunism. But is there also when it comes to the media, like to the Politico and in America, was taken over by Springer, his right-wing, pro-American, absolutely pro-American publication. But also here in the Far East, you had the Far East Economic Review, which was quite good. Had some economic problems, but it could have been solved. It was bought up by Murdoch. The next thing, he closed it down because it was not commercial competition. But is there in this type of in the pattern political Far Eastern economy? Is there a conspiracy out there to? I mean, they stand together to shut out whenever like a niche product, media product becomes too mainstream and threatens their view. So and it
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether there is a conspiracy, but often we do see a conspiracy when there are certain shared interests. And what are those shared interests? In keeping new independent-minded organizations, which Politico was in the beginning, or Vox, um, in making sure that they are very diffused soon of the possibility of dissent and any kind of breaking away from the mainstream. So the fact that it's not accidental that there are attempts to make them conform to conventional opinion very quickly. I don't think people are sort of sitting there and conspiring, but I think this is how shared interests interlock and create situations where these independent organizations soon lose their independence and are given huge incentives to the members of these institutions or these new institutions to essentially sell their souls. And I think for many of them, the offer is too tempting. You start off with the best intentions, and a right-wing German guy comes along and says, "I'm going to give you overvalue their company, give them billions of dollars." What happened just now with this hard right organization in the U.S., the Free Press, absurdly overvalued, sold for $450 million. The founder promoted to CBS, head of CBS News. So I think, again, I don't know whether there was any kind of conspiracy behind it, but certainly in the sense that, okay, we need to enforce in the marketplace of ideas the kind of ideas that benefit us the most. Otherwise, this marketplace is going to produce too many dangerous ideas that challenge our own primacy.
How do you think you'll cope with that?
Well, I think really partly by staying small. I think by staying small and nimble, by remaining modest in our aspirations and our ambitions, hoping for high impact interventions with some of the best talent in the world, but not sort of saying we're going to have correspondence in every, like Politico was absurdly overambitious in what it set out to do. We're not seeking, it would be absurd for us to think that we are seeking to rival the New Yorker, let alone the New York Times or anything. These are places with massive resources. But I think, there are still ways in which one can intervene while staying small and maintaining your integrity.
Pushback from these, especially as you're critical of them.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I think we are prepared for huge amounts of hostility. We did a big piece on the BBC, and it was hard to ignore because, it was a very long, detailed investigation of what has gone wrong with this big media organization, which used to be very trusted, and now it's really a shadow of itself. And there are many complex reasons why, it has gone wrong. Obviously, we were not invited to the BBC to discuss that piece, but there were others who were doing that. In the past, the BBC would have done that.
That's one question. We've spent a lot of time talking about Trump, and it's an obvious target, and it's the empire is crumbling very quickly, and giving rise. And part of your mission is to give voices to people in different parts of the world that have a different worldview and bring that to the English language audience. And yet at the same time, new power centers are arising, whether it's the UAE or China or Indonesia, and they have a very different view toward the liberal values that are underpinning Equator and all the projects I think we here have. So it's one thing to talk about, the far right in America or even the left, and all the issues that have been raised here. How will you also manage this in places where you don't even have a culture of free inquiry?
I think that's actually in a way, I would say it's not a question that occurs to us much because we're not seeking to intervene in these societies at all in the way the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Economist are all the time. We are not seeking to tell these societies how they should organize themselves politically or economically. We don't have that kind of ideological agenda at all. And if somebody wants to ban us in Indonesia, they're welcome to do that. But it won't affect us. We will continue to do what we do. We are not pro any or anti any government as such. We are here to report on the world as it actually is, without saying that there is one particular way of doing things and you're not doing it the right way. That is where the conflict arises, and I think that's where so many of these societies start to resist this kind of intellectual cultural imperialism. We're not getting into that business at all. We are very clear about that. We are not here to preach or to tell people how, like Economist carrying a editorial the other day, all Indonesia needs to do. They've carried like million versions of this article. They need to embrace the free market. How to organize the Indonesian economy. I think the time for these absurdities is now past. You have some undergraduates from Oxford or Cambridge sitting in central London telling Indonesians what to do. I'm sorry. Let's just move on from this absurdity. And so once we kind of break free from these sort of arrogant and increasingly absurd modes of journalism, I don't think we'll sort of encounter those kinds of problems. I think the problems emerge because you think you represent liberalism and the other party represents anti-liberalism. As it turns out, things are not so simple.
Let's do one last question, and then I'm going to have to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you. You actually answered in part the question that I was going to ask, but I ask it anyway because when I'm quite old. When I grew up in Europe, I knew two things. When I watched the 8 o'clock news in my small country, I'm from the Netherlands, everybody thought that whatever your political allegiance, the 8 o'clock news told you what happened today. And there was another thing, the newspapers, at least that's what we were told, separated reportage from op-ed and opinion making. And so my question was going to be to you, because I have a feeling that model of journalism has totally broken down, as you also amplified. My question was going to be, is your project about reportage, storytelling, or changing the world? But I think you just answered it. It is about reportage.
It is about reporting on the world with as much rigor as is possible, which means, as I said, drawing upon a lot of scholarship that exists, not presuming that, the journalist, the reporter is the privileged witness or the privileged observer of societies. That model has been defunct for some time now. And again, keeping clear of the ideological prejudices that have shaped so much of this journalism. I think, very clearly, the idea that there is a Western model and that Western model is successful, it's something that everyone else should be imitating. That's when you look at so much of journalism in the last 5 or 6 decades, that's the idea, that's the assumption that has underpinned it. We want to completely break with that assumption and say there is, this model was a creation of fantasy. The Western model had a lot of problems with it. Those problems were suppressed, were not looked at. Problems of other countries were highlighted to a great extent, but the problems within the Western model were not looked at. So we are in this situation where Trump has arrived. Europe is in the midst of a far-right surge. And the existing journalistic institutions have no idea how to diagnose this because they were so busy telling other people that you are illiberal, you don't have a proper system, you don't have this, you don't have that. Now there is a rise of illiberalism within the country. So this is why I think working with these kinds of assumptions that there is a certain part of humanity that is really solved, that has really broken through, we want to really break that. Certainly have reportage, have what I call cultural journalism, intellectual journalism, of a rigor that has gone missing in so much of that we see in the Western media.
Thank you, guys. I know everyone probably has many more questions that we could have gone on for a while, but I know that our staff wants to set us up for lunch pretty soon. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for this conversation. This has been very interesting. I think has given us all a lot to think about. So we really appreciate you taking the time to come by the FCC while you're in town.
Thanks very much, Morgan. And I can't let you all go without telling you to take this home and subscribe, tell other people, please spread the word. We need all the support.